Okay, great. So I'm going to begin. So what I want to try to do tonight is actually to deal with some sources that I assume are less familiar. They're somewhat new to me too, and we're not going to do a deep dive into these sources, but I think it's interesting to be aware of them. And sort of an invitation to all of us who are curious to explore these sources more. They're not all friendly to tradition, but I think, that in a way makes them more intriguing. When you have such a powerful story like the Exodus, of course, it evokes all sorts of reactions. And maybe what we begin with Freud is one that you've heard about. And we're not going to elaborate on Freud here, of course, but I just want to actually use Freud as a point of departure. And the truth is, my title, Retellings of the Exodus, it's going to be reversed. We're going to start with Freud and work our way back, if we can, get to Isaiah. We'll end with Isaiah. So I want to begin with Freud. And Freud in 1939 published his last work, known as Moses and Monotheism. And this was quite a startling last work. I guess on some level, we could say, well, he was alive, so he knew it would be last, but he was extremely ill. For those who know just the basic sketch of his biography, at this point, he has already fled from Vienna and he's in London, and he has advanced form of, a terminal illness, and he publishes this book. This book he worked on since 1934, and he published a part of it in 1937, but as a complete work, it only came out in 1939. And, that's always piqued the curiosity of, those who are fascinated with Freud, which is basically everybody on some level, whatever your exact disposition, but Freud is a fascinating person. And here's Freud, who his last work is taking on this, biblical topic and this Jewish topic, and, has, of course, a very complex Jewish identity, Freud. And the year is 1939. So where one's Jewish identity is, tragically such a, critical marker of a person, whether they want it to be or not. So given that backdrop, the fact that he publishes this work, could be a source of great anger to people, or, or other reactions, because in a way it's sort of debunking, in the Freud way, a lot of, I don't want what he would say are myths of tradition, of the Torah, of the Bible, and trying to sort of get beneath, in a form of psychoanalysis of the biblical story, to try to get to the repressed versions of the tale. And classic sort of Freud, whenever he ventures into any history, it's so sort of out there and speculative, and also fascinating. But so we're not going to get into his theory in any advanced way, but you see here, just from the his title of the different parts, the first wow thesis is that Moses isn't Jewish. Moses is an Egyptian. Not that he's a Jew who grows up in the Pharaoh's palace. That's the plain text of the Torah. That he is actually an Egyptian. And then part two is, well, if Moses was an Egyptian, how does that change things? And he proceeds to tell a very fantastic tale that there was not one Moses, there was two Moses, and Moses was a Egyptian priest who was preaching a form of monotheism to followers, and he had to sort of escape because they're so contrarian, and the followers couldn't handle it, and they proceeded to do, that act of, sort of a type of an Oedipal act of killing the father, and literally killing Moses. And then there's a second Moses, a whole fantastic Bubba Mice, if you will. But again, obviously there's all sorts of layers to his version. Some of this is building on Egyptology that Freud is reading from the late 19th century and certain historical, archaeological finds and other things, and piecing together again in very, very speculative ways and constructing this whole revised narrative. So let's just read a little bit from Freud here. This is the opening. To deny a people the man whom it praises as the greatest of its sons is not a deed to be undertaken lightheartedly, especially by one belonging to that people. And there Freud puts on the table his Jewish identity. Again, like I said, that's invited all sorts of explorations. Maybe most famously on that issue is the Jewish historian, the late Jewish historian at Columbia University, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, who wrote a book on the Jewish dimension of Freud and Freud's Moses. So he says it's not a simple thing what I'm about to do, to sort of take on and the Moses, the great hero, and deny him the praises. No consideration, however, will move me to set aside truth in favor of supposed national interest. So Freud says I'm animated by truth. Now, again, I think we have to be a little skeptical if we think he's animated by historical truth, but maybe he's, Freud also characterized a lot of his work as science and other things. So Freud might have had his own version of what he's doing, but maybe he means a certain psychological truth also. And again, I'm going to leave it at that realm of, maybe there's some, I think there is psychological fascination with his revisionary account. Again, I don't want to get that so bogged down. The main point, if you're just following along, is here Freud in 1939 publishes his last book, and basically the beginnings of the thesis is that Moses needs to be reconsidered, and that Moses is actually an Egyptian. And this is the way he just begins the beginning of part 2. If Moses was an Egyptian, in part 1 of this book, I've tried to strengthen by a new argument the suggestion that the man Moses, the liberator and lawgiver of the Jewish people, was not a Jew, but an Egyptian. And then he says, I get this from his name and from other arguments. Okay, and then again, he teases this out, and it's obviously a very subversive revisionary account of the Bible. That Moses isn't Jewish, that Moses is killed, and all sorts of other wild sort of ideas. Here we just have the cover of the French edition in 1939, which was illustrated by Salvador Dali. So here we have, if you just see the basic, we went through a full art historical analysis again. I'm interested in art, certainly not my expertise, but just the basic point over here is that we see the image of Moses, and it seems to be an adaptation of Michelangelo's Moses, including you see the crowns on top, but the face of Moses and the beard, of course, is within an eye, right? Do you see that? The Egyptian eye. And that's the Eye of Horus, which is a classic image in ancient Egyptian art, the image of one of the Egyptian gods, who's a god also of healing, and a god of magical powers. So Dali's trying to sort of capture some of the thrust of Freud's startling thesis that Moses has to be seen centered within a world of Egyptology, within the symbol of one of the gods of healing, God, classic image of an ancient Egyptian amulet that continued to live on, that image into the classical world and classical art. So that's Dali. And Dali had other illustrations also of Freud's Moses and monotheism. So we'll leave it at that. So that's sort of the backdrop to what I want to briefly talk about tonight. And it's really to just introduce people to a whole body of literature that, again, is quite fascinating and probably less familiar. So the idea that we just heard, that Moses is actually not Jewish, but Egyptian, that's an idea that maybe you could find out of some quarters of sort of archaeologists or historians who are obviously making all sorts of very, very speculative type of arguments. But what's more interesting to me in the present context is as an account, as a retelling of the story of the Exodus, that's an account that existed well before the year 1939 and Freud. And that's what we have actually in a second, just to show you a foil for a second. Let me go to it. Let's see it over here. I might go back to the foil. So here's where you see it. This idea that Moses is an Egyptian. I skipped one slide. It's okay. Maybe we'll go back, maybe we'll. But this is the main slide I actually want to get to next. And that is Josephus in a work against Appian. So I'll explain in a second, again, remind everybody who Josephus is and what the work against Appian is. But let's listen to Josephus. He's a great Jewish historian, of course, of the ancient world. And let's listen just to an opening line or two of Josephus. He says the following: "It remains for me to reply to him." I'll explain in a minute who him is, but it's basically a pagan writer regarding Moses. Although Egyptians consider this man marvelous and divine, they want to make him one of their own, with an implausible slander asserting that he was a Heliopolitan, one of the priests from there, driven out with the others on account of leprosy. Okay, I'll just pause there for a minute. What's Josephus saying? So Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian, the great ancient Jewish historian, just to locate him in time, he's writing this work at about the year 90 CE. So we're talking almost 2,000 years before Freud. And Josephus is rebutting a pagan argument that is out there. And the pagan argument is actually in a pagan version of the Exodus. And the pagan version of the Exodus argues that Moses was actually an Egyptian. He was an Egyptian priest related to Heliopolitan, the sun worship of the sun. And he was a priest who was actually forced out of Egypt because he had leprosy. That's what Josephus is. It's a version he's rebutting. Just to read a little of his rebuttal over here in line 280, I'm in this slide in the 5th line, but it is shown in the records that he lived, Moses meaning, 518 years earlier than the priests of Heliopolitan. So he's saying it just couldn't, that can't be what they're arguing. And he led our forefathers out of Egypt, meaning the Jews, into the land that is now inhabited by us, meaning Judea. I mean, that's interesting the way Moses, he says it, because Moses didn't get the Jews all the way to Judea, but he means he paved the way. 281, and it is clear from his own statements, meaning Moses' statement, that he did not suffer any physical misfortune of this sort, for he prohibited lepers from staying in a city or living in a village, requiring that they travel about alone with their clothes torn. And he regards as unclean anyone who touches them or lives under the same roof. What's his argument there? I want to make sure everybody's following. What Josephus says is, how could Moses have been an Egyptian who was a leper? If he was, first of all, he doesn't live at the time and place where this pagan author, I'll tell you his name is Manetho, okay? And he is a Egyptian pagan who lives around the 3rd century BC. It's 200-300 years before Josephus. There's this Egyptian pagan who writes that Moses was an Egyptian priest of the sun worshiping, and he had leprosy. And Josephus, of course, says this is totally wrong. And one, Moses lived earlier. And two, and this isn't the most convincing argument, just an interesting argument, especially in light of what we've been reading in the Torah on Shabbat the past few weeks. He says, why would the Torah have such harsh treatments of the leper? If Moses had been a leper, he would have been more sympathetic to leprosy. right? That's the argument that he says in line 281. It's clear from his own statements they did not suffer from this misfortune, right? Because he prohibited lepers from staying in a city or living in a village, and that they had to go out alone. Those are he's referring to Leviticus chapters 14, 15, what we recently read in synagogue. Yet to the contrary, on the contrary, it is likely that someone who had this affliction would have shown some consideration and benevolence to those whose misfortune was like his own. Okay, again, I don't think it's the most convincing argument, but of course, you don't need in other words, why is Josephus taking that? It sounds like just a fantastic, wild idea that Moses is Egyptian and has leprosy. But the reason he's taking the ink to react to this, spilling the ink to react to this, is obviously in the pagan world, there are people who know these versions of the tales of Moses. And that was the point I'm just trying to tell you tonight. It's not just Freud, who in the 20th century came up with wild, revisionist, and pretty offensive accounts of the Exodus. They actually have an ancient history to them, which is pretty fascinating. And Josephus had to rebut some of these accounts. By the way, footnote, the idea that Moses had leprosy actually is correct according to the Torah, ever so briefly, right? If you remember, early on in the book of Exodus, Moses, when he gets signs from God, when he's sent on his mission, he briefly has leprosy. That's one of the brief signs that Moses had. Then he's immediately cured. But you could almost see the origins. You sort of wonder, this Manetho, this pagan Egyptian who spins this sort of tale about Moses, is it just totally like spinning the yarn, or is it building off of some of the biblical account? And I'm saying actually leprosy is an interesting example where there is a moment in Exodus where Moses has leprosy. That's sort of interesting, just because it almost invites the speculation that Manetho or other pagans knew the Exodus story, maybe inside, and then found ways to sort of distort it, exaggerate it, and pervert it and subvert it. What is against Appian? Let me just say for a second what against Appian is, because that's where we want to go next. Against Appian is a work that Josephus writes. So just one more minute about Josephus, because I'm actually a big fan of Josephus. I think he's really one of the treasures that we have in our Jewish library that some of us don't know well enough. He is the great historian of Jewish antiquity. He lives through the revolt against the Romans in 66 through 70 CE. He's a general in that revolt in the Galilee, and he surrenders very controversially to the Romans, and he lives out his life in Rome as a sort of honorary prisoner of war. And he's this brilliant, very learned Jew. He's a Pharisee, he's a priest. And over the later part of his life, he becomes more and more a master of Greek, sitting in Rome, and he writes 4 works. The most famous 2, one's the account of the war against Rome, and another is a history of the Jews. I'll say those briefly, less relevant now. A lesser known work is the one we're looking at here, Against Appian. Who is Appian? Appian is a pagan who slanders the Jews. And in Josephus's last work, he rebuts basically anti-Semitic or disparagements of Judaism that he sees in the Greco-Roman world. And he says there's all sorts of distortions, exaggerations, slanders, perversions, subversions again of Judaism, and I'm going to rebut them, and I'm going to explain what makes Judaism great. It's actually a very moving work, because here he is sitting in Rome at the end of the 1st century CE, after the Romans have destroyed Judea and destroyed the temple. And he's writing basically a defense of Judaism and a rebuttal against anti-Jewish slanders. And Appian is one of the great slanderers of the pagan world. And Manetho is another. And there are all sorts of slanderers. And what's interesting is some of their slanderers, they mock Jews for all sorts of things, from being separate, for circumcising, for keeping Sabbath, for not eating pig, etc. But they also mock Judaism for the Exodus story. And the way they do that is that they distort the Exodus story. So here is a chart. I did not make up this chart, but it's actually a really helpful chart from a recent scholarly version of this work against Appian by a scholar named, I misspelled his first name. His first name is John, not Jonathan. Oh, maybe Jonathan, but I think it's John Barclay. Maybe it's Jonathan. Now I'm confused. But I know the name more as John Barclay. And John Barclay wrote a sort of some scholarly footnotes, and he put together this graph, and there's a lot in it. I don't expect us to follow all this graph, but what you see on the left side, if you follow the left column, is Manetho 1, Manetho 2, Karaman, Lysimachus, Appian. These are different pagan writers who give distorted versions of the Exodus tale. And they're pretty offensive to Jews. And one of the ways they are offensive to Jews is by taking Moses and saying, well, Moses is an Egyptian, or Moses is a leper, etc. It's not that the Jews wandered out of Egypt, it was that the Jews were expelled from Egypt and onward. And Josephus actually is our record of a lot of these pagan accounts. That's sort of fascinating. What I'm saying is, some of these accounts we wouldn't know were not for Josephus. Josephus preserves these pagan distortions of the Exodus and presents them briefly, and presumably pretty faithfully, because he has no reason not to present them faithfully. And he presents them, and then he responds and he rebuts them. Okay, so here you have some of the different accounts. Now Josephus, just briefly, Barclay summarizes what are the plot lines, and he says there are two classic plot lines you'll find in these accounts. It appears that I'm reading that the two main narrative lines that work in these stories. One is the story concerns an invasion of foreigners whose cruelty and impiety caused Egypt to rise in revolt and expel the outsiders. Do you understand how this turns the Exodus story on its head? What you have over here is that rather than the Israelites or the Hebrews or the Jews being the oppressed, in some of these pagan distortions, they're the oppressor. And the Egyptians are the oppressed, who then fight back and expel the foreign threat. Or a second version, number 2, in the second, some national calamity or divine wrath triggers the identification of an impure or diseased segment of the Egyptians who are expelled. Rather than talking about the Hebrews, there's actually part of the Egyptians who themselves are a lower class because they're sinners, they're impure, they're diseased, they're lepers, etc., and they're expelled. These are two sort of plot lines, and sometimes, as Barclay explained, sometimes these plot lines combine. Again, this is pretty disturbing stuff, because what it's showing is that 2,000 years ago, Jews had to deal with all sorts of hostile pagans, not only, but also. And part of what they did was they tried to undermine our tradition, which in a way I think should double down our sort of pride in our tradition, how we see it was always seen as a source of Jewish strength. So one of the ways to undermine Jewish strength was to try to undermine its most basic traditions, the Torah and its great foundational tale of the Exodus from Egypt, and to try to undermine it. And thank God, in a sense, we live in a world where none of us have heard of these pagan writers. Maybe it's sort of curious that I bringing it to your attention. I just think it's sort of fascinating, but we could sort of, I think, take a lot of consolation, not only that they faded, but it really shows the strength of our tradition that's been around for so long, and that people felt the need that Gentile pagans, again, just some, I don't want to make it like all Gentiles and all pagans were hostile. The opposite. Josephus is living a pretty good life in Rome, right? It also shows Josephus's confidence in Rome. Here he is sitting in Rome and defending Judaism. So obviously some, and remember, Rome just defeated the Jews in Judea and destroyed their temple, and yet Josephus feels comfortable enough to write this work in Greek. Okay, pretty fascinating moment. So it obviously shows that Jews did find ways to have good conditions in Rome, even post the revolt, at least some Jews, but there was a lot of sort of early anti-Semitism, or what one scholar calls Judeophobia, a fear or hatred of Judaism, which he responds to in his last work Against Appian. And Josephus explains here in this same work Against Appian, in a paragraph, a little bit what he thinks is animating these pagan writers, like Manetho, who is an Egyptian pagan. He's an Egyptian pagan, so it's not enough that the Egyptians in the past were, Pharaoh was trying to destroy the Israelites, but a 3rd century pagan Egyptian, probably like a Hellenized Egyptian, right? Well, or I don't know, it's probably pre-Hellenized around then. But this pagan Egyptian, Manetho, is trying to undermine the Torah's Exodus narrative and others. And Josephus says the following about them: it was Egyptians who initiated the slanders against us. And certain people who want to gratify them attempted to twist the truth, neither admitting the arrival of our ancestors, meaning Jews, Israelites in Egypt, as it actually took place, nor truthfully recounting their exodus. They had many reasons for hate and envy. In other words, Egyptians had reasons to hate us and envy us. Originally, and by the way, pay attention to this line. If you could follow me now, I'm on about the 5th line right after the 2 dots. Originally, because our ancestors held sway over their land, meaning the ancestors of Josephus, meaning the ancient Jews, meaning the Israelites in the book of Exodus, held sway over their land. And what does he mean? Is he referring to some midrash or something? Or maybe he's not referring to the book of Exodus. Maybe he's referring to the end of Genesis, Joseph. And maybe the Jews were proud that at one point they had such a high role, a powerful role in Egypt, and that bothered some pagans. It's a very interesting line there. Originally, because our ancestors held sway over their land, and when they moved from there to their homeland, meaning when the Israelites left Egypt and eventually got to Israel, they again prospered. Then the opposition of these nations has aroused in them a great animosity, since our piety differs from what is customary among them to the same degree that the nature of gods stands removed from irrational animals. And here Josephus goes on the offensive. He basically says us Jews are rational, we have a pure theology, etc., and these pagans are basically irrational animals. Pretty harsh sort of name calling in the reverse. He calls them empty-headed, utterly foolish, etc. And then he says at the very end, some of their numbers reach such a level of folly and pettiness that they did not hesitate to contradict even their ancient records. And that's why he says you find all sorts of perversions of the Exodus story, because they're just trying to write lies and slanders, and they don't care to be consistent. Let me summarize just to make sure everybody's following along what we've talked about. We're just basically learning some history, but I hope the history is sort of enlightening and illuminates how, we've had not the easiest history always, which we know, but this is a chapter maybe we're less familiar with. And I started with a Jew, a very famous 20th century Jew named Freud, with a pretty complicated Jewish identity. And Freud's very last work on the eve of the Holocaust, pretty shockingly, is Moses and Monotheism, where he really undermines the classical version of the biblical account of the Exodus account, beginning with the idea that Moses is an Egyptian. And then we move to the ancient world. And what I want to present and what I want to show here is that 2,000 years before Freud, there were other distortions of the Exodus that abounded, that were around. And the way we know this, mainly so far from what we read tonight, is through Josephus, of course, a very proud Jew of the ancient world. But Josephus is such a proud Jew that he feels the need as a historian to correct the record. and to rebut all these Gentiles and pagans, their scholars, their historians, that the ones that he knows about, who are, distorting the biblical record by retelling the Exodus story in a way that is mocking the Exodus story. And Josephus, one by one, goes through about 5 pagan versions of the Exodus that are, undermining the biblical account, and Josephus rebuts them. That's what we've said so far. Now, even after or in the course of Josephus is mainly responding to earlier people, but almost contemporary to Josephus is a famous Roman historian, Tacitus. And Tacitus is basically doing the same thing. In other words, Josephus is responding to critics from the past, but you might wonder, why is he talking about people who lived 200 years before him, pagans who are criticizing the biblical record? And part of the answer, I said, is because apparently their versions have some traction in the world around them. And to sort of substantiate that, we could point to a Roman historian who, in his history, his just general history, talks about Judea. That's not so surprising, because Judea is part of the Roman world in the first century CE. And then when he talks about Judea, he talks about Jerusalem, and then he talks about the Jews, and then he talks about the Exodus. And again, I don't want to get totally bogged down in the details, but the overall arc you could see is also quite a distortion, but a disturbing distortion, a mocking distortion of the Exodus. And you wonder, did Tacitus make this up? Or is this versions that Tacitus heard, maybe embellishing a bit? But pretty disturbing that these are, ideas out there by leading Roman historians talking about the Exodus in the first century CE. So he tells us the following. Let's just read a little bit. Most authorities agree that a foul and disfiguring disease once broke out in Egypt. There you have it, sort of similar to the idea of the leprosy. And that King Bacchus, who was one of the ancient kings, on approaching the oracle, was told to purge his kingdom of the plague and to transport all who suffered from it into some other country, for they had earned the disfavor of heaven. So the Egyptian king is basically told by an oracle, get rid of these sinners who are suffering from this plague. A motley crowd was thus collected and abandoned in the desert. While all the other outcasts lay idly lamenting, one of them, named Moses, advised them not to look for help to gods or men, since both had deserted them, but to trust rather in themselves, except as divine the guidance of the first being by whose aid they should get out of their present plight. So basically, of this group that's been expelled, who are just wandering around like nomads, in the midst of them, Moses emerges. And Moses is basically this very impressive personality. That's the slight compliment he's paying here, but that's about it. He's an impressive nomad who takes charge. And he gives an account of the way he takes charge and saves them. He also mitigates, by the way, the role of God here in his version. And then in the next page, then he talks about how they get into, they move on. But I want us just to note some things as we read this. Continuing their march for 6 successive days, on the 7th, they routed the natives and gained possession of the country. And you wonder, is he just making this up? He's saying Moses and the nomads, in 6 days, they march, and on the 7th day, they gain possession of the country, meaning of Israel. But that's, what I want to say, I'm not going to do it so carefully. If you pore over this account and comb through it, you'll see certain things that are in the Bible, but obviously cherry picking. Like this seems to be based on the book of Joshua, where the city of Jericho is surrounded for 6 days, and on the 7th is conquered by Joshua and his soldiers. So that is a conquest of Canaan, of Israel, miraculously 6 days, and then on the 7th. Of course, Joshua has all sorts of other battles, and those he skips over. And then he says, to ensure his future hold over the people, Moses introduced a new cult. So he's saying it's all Moses who made up this new cult. And what's the characteristic? And this is interesting. that it's opposite of other religions. All that we hold sacred, they hold profane. Allowed practices which we abominate. In other words, what marks Judaism in the eyes of Tacitus? That it's contrarian. And that's pretty interesting, because some of what Judaism is trying to do is trying to, delimit and demarcate an identity that will not assimilate into the all-powerful Roman world. And Tacitus sort of sees it in this way, and he says, Jews, they're the opposite of us. But obviously, once you start using those polarities, that is sort of on the pretty verge of what, very disturbing anti-Semitic ideas. So let me just give you one example of another thing that he might have gotten from the actual Bible. Look at the next line. They dedicated in a shrine an image of the animal whose guidance had put an end to their wandering and thirst. So I'm sorry I'm not being more interactive, but he's talking about the Jews have a shrine of an image of an animal who helped them. Now, maybe this is based on Exodus 32, the sin of the golden calf. Of course, within the biblical record, that's a terrible thing. And here he's saying, well, that's part of the practice of Judaism. So what I'm saying is, what you have, let me just give you one other example. Let me skip to 5 lines from the bottom, right after I have an ellipse. And in token of the corn they carried off, Jewish bread is to this day made without leaven. There you go. You have it for Passover. Tacitus, Roman historian, is saying, what's Jewish bread? Jewish bread is matzah. Okay, now he never says that's Jewish bread on Passover. He says matzah is in general Jewish bread. That's a pretty interesting idea. That we usually don't think of that. We think of it as, sure, it's Jewish bread, but just for 8, in 7 days or 8 days, for us here in New York. Okay, so let me just summarize. What I'm adding over here is Josephus is working hard to rebut pagan distortions, but even in his lifetime or shortly after his life, here you have a leading Roman historian who's continuing these distortions, and you could see the hatred, sadly, of Judaism that's seeping through, and also probably a lot of misunderstanding. And so you wonder, is this all distortion, perversion, or also ignorance? And this is by a leading thinker in the Roman world. Now, it's not all bleak, okay? Not all pagans who are writing about the Exodus are just saying hostile things. So, for example, if you go to Strabo, Strabo is one of the great figures in the classical world associated with geography, and that's the image over there with the globe. He writes, Strabo the geographer. He writes this great, one of the most famous early geographies of the world, and by geography meaning exploring the ancient world and telling you about the landscape and who lives where, and some ethnic reporting about the people who live. So Strabo gives us one of our ancient accounts of Judea. And he literally tells us about the landscape of Judea, of Palestine, etc. And he tells us also along the way some things about the Jews. So just briefly, let's look what he says. Now, he also has all sorts of misunderstandings. But what's interesting about Strabo is I don't think in Strabo you get the negativity. Strabo is more sort of just giving you an account of the Jews with all sorts of, distorted ideas. So let's just read a little from Strabo. As for Judea, the most prevalent of the accredited reports in regard to the temple at Jerusalem represents the ancestors of the present Judeans, as they are called, as Egyptians. So you see Strabo's sort of confusion. He knows that Jews have a history that traces back to Egypt, but he assumes, therefore, the Jews came out of the Egyptians. Line 35, the third line there, Moses, namely, was one of the Egyptian priests and held a part of Lower Egypt, as it is called, but he went away from there to Judea. And why did he go away? By the way, it's not about God and all that, but you see, it's about Moses, but Moses' theology, since he was displeased with the state of affairs there and was accompanied by many people who worship the divine being. For he says and taught that the Egyptians were mistaken in representing the divine being by the images of beasts and cattle, as they were also the Libyans, and that the Greeks were also wrong in modeling gods in human form. So that's pretty interesting. He's saying that what the Jews began as Egyptians, but Egyptians were offended by the theology of Egypt, it's idolatrous theology, which then Strabo links to the Greek iconography and statues and images of gods in human form, the whole, sort of Greek pantheon of, or the deities of the Greek world. For according to him, meaning Moses, God is the one thing alone that encompasses us all, encompasses land and sea, the thing which we call heaven or universe, or the nature of all that exists. Okay, etc. And then he continues on and he says other things about, just let's read one more line here, or a couple more lines quickly. Now Moses, saying things of this kind, persuaded not a few thoughtful men and led them away to this place, meaning to Judea, where the settlement of Jerusalem now is. Here's Strabo the geographer. He's saying that's Jerusalem today. By the way, it's interesting in all these accounts, Moses leads them to Jerusalem. Of course, that's telescoping and or miswriting, what happened, as we know from the Bible. It's Moses makes it to the plains of Moab, doesn't enter into the land. Joshua enters the land, and it's only David, centuries later, who establishes Jerusalem as the kingdom. But in these accounts, it's all Moses. And then he says, he took possession of the place, third line, since it was not a place that would be looked on with envy, nor yet one of which anyone would make a serious fight, for it is rocky. That's a pretty fascinating line. What's he saying? He's saying nobody wants Jerusalem. Okay, go tell that to the world in the 21st century. That's pretty amazing line in the year, in the first century CE. Nobody wants Jerusalem, although it's pretty ironic even in the first century, as the Romans have just, conquered Jerusalem. Okay, and then he says other interesting things also in the continuation, and he talks about, interesting things. But the reason I'm bringing this source is to show you that there were pagans who were fascinated by the Jews, who were curious by the Jews, who understood that the Jewish story is begins with the Exodus, but have totally sort of corrupt or just erroneous accounts of the Exodus. Some of that seems to be animated by a harboring great animus against the Jews. Deep, ugly anti-Semitism or anti-Semitism is hatred. Judeophobia is just fear of those other people. And then you have something like Strabo, where I think overall it's pretty positive, his account. Even though Moses began as an Egyptian, but I think by and large, he's impressed with Moses, and he's impressed with the Jews and the purity of their belief. It's interesting how here you have this, Roman geographer who's talking about, sort of the errors of classical thought about gods, the deities of the Greeks, and talking about Judaism as pure monotheism, and then talking about, Jerusalem, and there he's a little more sort of dismissive a little bit of its, at least its natural terrain, etc. But this certainly I don't think is negative overall, the overall tone. Now, I want to now give another example of a pagan or Gentile account of the Jewish story that continues in this vein, and I think is even more overall positive, even though it has a lot of misunderstandings in it. And that's an earlier, now I'm going back in time. I'm sorry, I'm breaking out of my chronology. I'm going to the 4th century BCE. This is a text that I find very interesting. It's actually, you see there's a question mark on top, Hecates of Abdera. If you never heard of Hecates of Abdera, no problem. You're not alone. Almost nobody has heard of him unless you happen to know this passage. But Hecataeus is this, pagan or Gentile who lives in the 4th century in Egypt, who writes in Greek about not really about the Jews so much. He writes more about the Egyptians. But in the midst of writing about the Egyptians, then he turns and talks about the Jews. Just a word or two very briefly. Let me keep it brief. Maybe at some point I'll come back to this text in another lecture because it's really a rich, interesting text in my mind. But Hecataeus, the reason I have a question mark is there's a long-standing scholarly debate about whether this paragraph that we're about to read a little of, was it genuinely written by a Hecataeus of Abdera, who we know lived in the 4th century, a Gentile who lived in Egypt and wrote in Greek? There was such a figure. We know there was such a figure. The question is this genuinely from his hand? Or was this a later Jewish forgery that was attributed to him? Now, I've read a fair amount of the scholarly debate on this issue because I'm interested in this paragraph for various reasons. And I'm more convinced by the theories that say this is original and this really was Hecataeus. One other thing that I won't confuse you with right now, but the very next line you'll see Hecataeus, but it actually says Photius cites Diodorus, who cites Hecataeus. And that you don't need to know. It's totally fine if you don't know who Photius is or Diodorus is, but what I want you to understand is how rare a thing it is that we have this text in our hand. We no longer have the writings of Hecataeus. A small amount of the writings of Hecataeus, who lived 4th century BCE, came into the hands of Diodorus, who lived in the 1st century BCE. Some of Diodorus gets quoted by Photius, who I forget when he lived, but I think like 7th, 8th century CE. So it's just this amazing sort of sequence of citations over like 900 years that gives us this paragraph. One more word about this paragraph. Why is it so important? Why, you might ask, why am I getting so excited about it? We even haven't read it. It's less about its content. It's that if it is truly Hecataeus, this is arguably the oldest account of the Jews written by a Gentile that we have, period. Okay? Aristotle, like in one place, mentions the Jews. This is pre, right? And here you have a description of the Jews. So, Aristotle's around the time of Alexander the Great, end of the 4th century. This is earlier. So this is a Gentile talking about the Jews. Now let's just read a little bit. Maybe I spent too much time on setting it up, but it's just also fascinating. So let's read a little bit, and you'll see some of the distortions, of course, but you'll see how it's positive. Let's read together just a bit. When in ancient times a pestilence arose in Egypt. So he's beginning with pestilence. So what's that? That we know as Dever, one of the 10 plagues. But he doesn't see it as one of 10 plagues. He just talks about pestilence. There was a pestilence in Egypt. The ordinary people ascribed their troubles to the working of a divine power. For indeed, with many strangers of all sorts of dwelling in their midst and practicing different habits of rites and sacrifices, their own traditional observance and honor of the gods had fallen into disuse. So the story he's telling is that within Egypt there was pestilence. And pestilence, the Egyptians assumed, was a result of a minority group, strangers, so they might not be really Egyptians. They seem to be strangers who are not practicing Egyptian religion, but their own religion. Hence, I continue, the natives of the land surmised that unless they removed the foreigners, their troubles would never be resolved. So now on this version, the Egyptians said, we better expel them, not because they feared for their lives, but why did they fear for their lives? Because they saw a plague, and they assumed the plague was because the Egyptian gods were angry. Not because the God of Israel was angry, because the Egyptian gods were angry. There's a distortion. And once, therefore, 5 lines in the bottom, the aliens were driven from the country, and the most outstanding and active among them banded together, and as some say, were cast ashore, etc. Fine, we could skip. But the greater number were driven into what is now called Judea, which is not far from Egypt, and was at the time utterly desolate. It's interesting. None of them say that there were Canaanites living in Judea. It's nobody wants it. It's desolate. And then the colony was headed by a man called Moses, outstanding both in wisdom and courage. On taking possession of the land, he found it, besides other cities, one that is now the most renowned, Jerusalem. And then he talks also about the laws and basically the polity that Moses set up. Again, all sorts of misunderstandings here, right? That he knows certain things from the Bible, right? He seems to know about Dever, pestilence, right? He seems to know about the idea that there was a minority who weren't Egyptians who were practicing a different religion. That he seems to know. And then he knows about Moses, but then he says Moses is the founder of Jerusalem, etc. But look at the way he describes Moses, outstanding for wisdom and courage. And then Moses basically is the founder of the lawgiver and the founder of a polity. Now remember, for those who are writing in Greek, there's no greater compliment than to describe somebody as outstanding in wisdom, courage, right? A classic, Hellenistic virtue, wisdom, courage, and a giver of law, like Solon, the great Greek giver of the law. Moses is a giver of the law, and the founder of a polity, which of course is the ultimate thing, a statesman. In other words, here Moses is being described as a statesman, and I'll leave it at that. He also talks about Jewish worship. So I'm saying now we've gotten even beyond Strabo, because here you have a distorted account that's written, and I'm saying according to the scholarly reconstruction I find more convincing, it's written by a Gentile. Very early, 4th century BCE in Egypt, who basically tells a version of the Exodus that has all sorts of errors, but overall the thrust of the story, by and large, is very favorable. I mean, here and there it's saying things that aren't favorable, but overall it's very favorable because the climax is Moses, wise, courageous, lawgiver, and statesman. And that's the head of the Jews who live in Judea. So sometimes these alternate accounts are actually very, sort of complementary in their overall tone. I want to just go a few minutes, and I'm just going to briefly touch on one and maybe one other text. And here again, these are great texts, so part of me feels a little guilty doing them quickly. But let me just touch on them because I think I want to round out the lecture for an hour, so I'll just very briefly touch on them and explain what they are. The last two texts, one is this one, which I'll just say a word about the context, and then if I can, I'll say a word about Isaiah. But there, obviously, when you hear Isaiah, but also this text, the author is a Jew. And here what's interesting is you have a Jew who tells us something that's not exactly a retelling of the Exodus, but it clearly, I think, is playing with the Exodus and is playing with the Exodus themes in a way that's surprising. And I want to sort of continue in that favorable note of Jews and Gentiles getting along well. So over here, I'll just briefly say what this is. This requires a lot more elaboration, and hopefully we'll have opportunities to elaborate, not just on this paragraph, other paragraphs. The letter of Aristeas is a 2nd century BCE text, very old. That means it's over 2,000 years old, right? And it seems, again, by scholarly reconstruction, not on its face, but by scholarly reconstruction, the author of the letter is a Jew who lives in the diaspora. It's a Jew who lives in Alexandria, a Jew who lives in Egypt. Now just think for a second, a Jew who lives in Egypt, in Alexandria, in the 2nd century BC has an interesting Jewish identity on Passover, right? They're sitting there keeping the Seder in Alexandria, talking about the horrible Egyptians, and talking about Pharaoh and talking about never seeing the Egyptians again, and they're living in Alexandria. That's, already a very interesting, that's part of the richness of the Jewish story, that things get complicated. So here you have this, by, the scholarly consensus. The author is a Jew living in Alexandria who is writing, and this is, again, a fabrication on the scholarly reconstruction of a letter. And let me just briefly read the part of the letter, or I'll just read a line or two and then we'll skip. It's a 2nd century Ptolemaic king, who is the king of Egypt in the 2nd century BCE, who's writing a letter to the high priest in Jerusalem. But listen what he tells in the letter. He says, and I'll just read a little bit. 2nd line, since there are many Jews settled in our realm, there are a lot of Jews who live in Egypt, who were carried off from Jerusalem by Persians at the time of their power, and many more who came with my father into Egypt as captives. In other words, the Persians, when they dominated Judea, according to this record, and this probably has historical veracity on this level, Jews were forced to do slave labor work. They were captives of the Persians and then of the Egyptians in the 2nd century BC. We're talking about 1,000 years after the Exodus story. Large numbers of these he placed in the army. So my father had Jewish captives in his army in Egypt. But what did he do? He paid them good wages. And when he had proved the loyalty of their leaders, he built fortresses and placed them in their charge. And when I ascended the throne, adopted a kindly attitude towards my subjects, and more particularly those who were citizens of yours, I have set at liberty more than 100,000 captives, so he says. Now, again, how much of this is myth or reality? It's hard to imagine. It's all just a story, even if it's a Jew pretending to speak as the Egyptian ruler of Egypt in the 2nd century BCE. I don't think he could totally fabricate all of this, otherwise it wouldn't make any sense to readers. So what's he saying? But what he's saying, I do think, has a certain trope to it. What's the Egyptian leader of the 2nd century BCE? He's a king who has Jewish slaves, who treats them well and then frees them. Wow, that's a nice story. That's a much nicer story than the story of what Pharaoh did to the Jews. What I'm suggesting, and I'm not the first person to suggest this, is that in this text, you see maybe somewhat reality, somewhat wishful thinking, somewhat sort of coloring, but you see a Jew who's living in the 2nd century BCE who wants to tell a different story. Maybe he knows the ancient story, no doubt he does. No doubt he celebrates Pesach, right? No doubt he keeps the Seder. And the reason I say no doubt, if you read the whole work, it's filled with a description of the importance of the Torah. So the author, no doubt, kept the Torah and kept Pesach, but along the way, he also has a more modern story to tell. And the more modern story to tell is a much happier story of an Egyptian king who is kind and benevolent and who has Jewish slaves, but treats them well. And then actually he frees them. And then he gives them reparations. Unlike the Exodus story where Jews had to find a way to get some, money from the Egyptians with sleight of hand, here they're given reparations. I'll leave it at that. We really don't have time for the last source, which I'm sorry because it's my title. But the truth is, I'd feel bad rushing it. There's an amazing prophecy in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 19, which is about Egypt. Not about the ancient Egypt of Pharaoh, but about the Egypt of the day of Isaiah. And, I'll just maybe just read a line, just one line from this prophecy. Look at verse 20. It will be a sign and a witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. When they cry to the Lord because of the oppressors, he will send them a savior. Who's the one who's crying to the Lord here? To God, to Hashem, in Isaiah 19. It's the Egyptians. The Egyptians are crying to God and God saving the Egyptians. It's an amazing prophecy. It's more complicated than that because Isaiah 19, at first God punishes the Egyptians, and in the end of the chapter, God saves them and redeems them. And that's in my title. I say repression or redemption. Because in this account, this is not the ancient Exodus stories. This is Isaiah's prophecy on Egypt. But there clearly seems to be a wish for a better story, where Egyptians aren't just, the evil empire. That was the ancient Egyptians. But these Egyptians ultimately will be punished, but then redeemed. Okay, I'm out of time. Let me just summarize what we did tonight. I hope it was an interesting, it was sort of, a tour of some texts that aren't so familiar. I know it was a fair amount. Hopefully it'll be on the YouTube channel. If you want to look back, you could also ask me. I'll stay after the Zoom also now if you have any comments or questions. But let me briefly just summarize in 90 seconds what we tried to do tonight. We began with Freud and Freud's 1939, very controversial last work, Moses and Monotheism, where Freud is trying to sort of shock in his final work by taking on, the sacred, narrative of the Jews. And here Freud, the Jew on the eve of the Holocaust, maybe very disturbingly, writes this work that, again, I think we should give him a little more credit because I think for him, the real impulse is psychological and psychoanalytical sort of dimensions and less the story. But he does get to the story of the Exodus and he totally subverts it. Moses is an Egyptian, Moses is killed, all sorts of wild ideas. And maybe that was familiar to some of you, but I assume most of us here were less familiar, me too, with the fact that there's a very ancient chapter to these distortion of Exodus narratives. So what we did was we looked at Josephus, first century CE Jewish historian, who in his last work against Appian rebuts pagan distortions of the Exodus and goes through about 5 distortions. And then we saw that in his own lifetime, or a little after him, there's a Roman historian, Tacitus, who's also distorting the Exodus narrative. And what seems to animate these distortions are either anti-Semitism or Judeophobia, fear of Jews. But then we try to move in a little more of an optimistic direction. And we said, but there are other pagans who have misunderstandings or distortions, but they're not anti-Jewish, like Strabo, the geographer. And then we move to somebody like Hecataeus. We move back to the 4th century BCE, the oldest Gentile account of the Jewish story, which has all sorts of distortions, but ultimately describes the Jews being led by Moses, who is the wise, the courageous, the lawgiver, and the ultimate statesman. And then at the end, I moved from Gentiles talking about the Jewish story to Jews who, not directly, but sort of indirectly, are trying to improve the Gentile role in the story. And we saw the letter of Aristeas, where you have this Jew in the 2nd century BCE, who is describing a almost contemporary, slightly prior to his lifetime, ruler of Egypt, a Ptolemean, meaning a Greco-Roman ruler of Egypt, who has Jewish slaves, but treats them well and frees them and gives them reparations. Wow, that's a nicer tale. And then at the very end, going back to our sacred Tanakh and just hinting that all of us have to read Isaiah 19 more carefully. And I hope to talk about this more at some future point, because this is a stunning chapter in Yeshayahu, where Yeshayahu talks about God, a prophecy, not of the ancient Egyptians, but a prophecy of, either the present or the future Egyptians, who God will punish, but then God will heal and redeem. In this chapter, Egypt is not left as the evil empire that's destroyed forever, but rather who joins Israel in being redeemed and recognizing God. I'll leave it at that. If anybody has questions or comments, please feel free.
Alexandria,